So, drawing a room is much harder than drawing a road. I'm going to try and explain it to the best of my ability, but here I'm starting it off a little bit different. I'm trying to figure out where that trim goes, and it really does help to follow along with that reference picture right by your board so you can look at it. So, that is a trim on the side. From there, I'm going to find a vanishing point. So you are working in one of your, obviously, one of your quarters of your paper. This is your second quarter, and you're going to be putting in a vanishing point in a minute because I'm going to show you how to get the side of the room. So there's a vanishing point, that little dot there up on the screen. And from that dot, you are going to find the side of that room. So we have the trim that is just horizontal, that is not in perspective, and then we have the vanishing point. So you're going to go to that vanishing point and you're going to align up the edge of the ruler, and you're going to look at your reference photo and see where does that trim go off the paper. So I just made a couple of lines that are following that vanishing point. That's going to end up being the side wall, the one that is in perspective. And then I'm going to be doing a parallel vertical line up to indicate that side wall. So now you can see a back side, which is a flat wall, not going back in space. And you have the wall to the right, which looks more like a trapezoid at the moment. So when you're doing a room, you're doing basically the inside of a box. So you want to make sure it looks like a cube. And I'm going to the top of the paper to figure out the top part of the wall, because if you were to just leave it, it wouldn't look correct. And I'm erasing out a line that I don't need there. So that's the thing about perspective. You always have to anticipate the lines you're going to be erasing because you don't really want any extra strings attached, because that's A, confusing, and B, it disrupts the illusion. So now we have a wall that's going back and we have a wall that is on the side. Now this picture in particular has these big heavy beams of wood, so I'm going to be drawing those in loosely. Now just so you know, I'm not drawing every single thing in this picture because we are working on a paper that's roughly the size of a postcard, and it's hard to get detail, and it's also easier to make mistakes on a smaller sheet. It's harder to be accurate. Okay, so going to the back wall, we're going to get that window in. So there is a window that's kind of to the right on that back wall, and it's rectangular, although it's recessed. So we're going to go ahead and draw that rectangular shape. So you're going to find that this drawing is a whole lot more complex than the road. There's a lot of little detail stuff, and it starts off pretty basic, but then it gets complex on you. So I'm trying to figure out there, I put a little mark to indicate the middle of that rectangle so I can figure out the arch. You have to know the middle of your rectangle to get the peak of your arch correct if you're going to try and go for the arch. Now you can simplify some of these things, like you can just leave the window as a rectangle if that would be easier. And by the way, this drawing isn't as detailed as it could be. You could always find more detail, especially if you have time and inclination. So I'm just drawing that center line to the window and dividing that window space into thirds, or at least I will at a later point. Okay, so I need that window there, including the middle line of that window pane, to indicate where to put the couch. So everything fits together kind of like a puzzle. And when you look at that couch, you first want to start off with a basic rectangle, and that rectangle is the armrest that is closest to the viewer, closest to us. So we're going to start off with that armrest, and you could see that couch is kind of like a L shaped. It's like a backwards L. So here's a rectangle. And you can see I do basic like little light outlines to indicate things before I draw them heavy. So it starts off as a rectangle, and then there's the back of the couch there, and then it gets a little bit tricky. So the couch is essentially like a complex cube, like those floating blocks that you did the other day. So now I'm going to have to attach the sides of that couch rectangle to the vanishing point. Now, one thing, as you get better, more familiar with one-point perspective, you'll realize that you don't have to draw the lines all the way back to the vanishing point. You can draw them as long as you need them. So if you know that the couch arm is short and it doesn't go very far off in the distance, you don't have to draw them all the way back. You can just stop your line before going all the way back, because otherwise you're going to have to do a lot more erasing. So there's always shortcuts that you can apply. So that's the back of the couch there. I'm zooming in so you can see what I'm doing here, because it's kind of hard to see from a distance. And remember the rule of angular transfer. You want to check the angle and then transfer that angle back to the back of the couch there. If you get the angle wrong, it could look really funny. So if you start to notice that there's a problem with one of your objects, ask a neighbor to take a look and see if they can spot the issue. So again, there's the armrest, we have the back of the couch, there's going to be a little segment of the couch that you can see, it's the part that you sit on, and then there's going to be a second armrest. But it does need to go back to that single vanishing point. So you guys are starting to pick up on the pattern that everything goes back to that singular vanishing point. Now this is effective, so it will work. And a lot of artists do employ the use of perspective in their work, sometimes as a backdrop, sometimes as the main idea. So here's one of the arm rests. It's that secondary one. And you can see I do free draw a little bit. Some of it you actually have to. And you can see I'm correcting. I never just get it right perfect like the first time. I make adjustments. You can sort of see the couch taking place. Okay, so now we're going to get that little tiny end table. And for that, I'm actually going to freehand it. You could use perspective in theory to get the top part. You'd have to do some interesting kind of geometry to it, but why do that when you can freehand pretty effectively? You just want to tell yourself that it is a very narrow oval for the top of that tiny end table. So now I'm moving to the actual coffee table. So I'm starting off with a rectangle. So that rectangle is not the top of the coffee table. It's the coffee table viewed from the side, which is actually kind of a coffee table with a shelf. So it's really important that you start off with a rectangle on these rectangular shapes, parallelograms. And then I'm going back to the vanishing point. You notice how I didn't draw it all the way back there? That's also so I can save time and not have to erase everything I do. And the more you do this, the quicker you'll get at it. This is a slightly time lapse, but I can draw in perspective pretty fast. I did tell you guys I was pretty bad at perspective when I was in junior highs when I first was introduced to it, and then no, it wasn't great freshman year of high school, and I didn't get a solid understanding until like junior or senior year. And after that, I didn't even think I would use it. But it's become a really good tool. I decided later on in life, like, this is actually a really valid tool and it can help you to be way more accurate. and it's one way of creating space or depth. So there is a chair or couch love seat behind that coffee table, and that's what I'm drawing in there. It is going to the vanishing point, and then behind there is going to be the fireplace. So there should be like a big fireplace in there. So if you're not sure if something goes back to the vanishing point, hold your ruler against it. If it's angling back to that singular vanishing point, then you know it does. So you can actually look at a reference picture and find the vanishing point. You can do this in real life too. I've done it. But you can look at where everything is kind of angling back to if it's a one-point perspective, and you can find that single vanishing point. The good news is with the fireplace, it is mostly not in perspective, so it's flat. The only thing that is in perspective is there's a slight edge to it on the right-hand side where you can see two sides, and that is slightly going back to that vanishing point. The hood part you can free draw, like the chimney, the top part of the chimney. And there is a rug on the floor that's also going back to perspective. And there's a bench there to the right. So we're going to work on the windows a little bit. Those windows are divided up into 6 panes of glass, so into thirds. And then there's a pot just underneath that main window there with a live tree in it. So we're going to get that in because it's always kind of fun to have an organic shape amongst the geometric. Plus you get to freehand it. There is a window bank on the right side, so on the wall that's in perspective, and those windows need to angle back. Fortunately, they go all the way to the floor, so that means less work for you. But you do want to make sure that those windows line up with that other window frame. So you want to make sure that they're divided similarly. And you want to make sure that that vertical center line is in the right place. It's not in the middle. It's actually closer to the vanishing point. And then those are heavy framed, black framed windows. So I'm going to darken those to help my mind to see them more as a window too. In order to do the floorboards or that pattern that exists on the floor, it's large tiles actually, you would have to angle back to the vanishing point so those lines are fanning out. For this, you'd want to eyeball or gauge equal distance apart. So it's essentially the same thing you'd do if you had floorboards. You'd do them the same thickness, all going back to a singular vanishing point. This will also help that idea of perspective too. If you were going to try and do the tile pattern, you'd have to go back in with a horizontal line on top, and the horizontal line would start out wide at the bottom of the page, and the closer they get to the vanishing point, the tighter the lines would get, so the less of a gap in between them. And that's what I'm doing there. Technically, the pattern on the floor is a staggered pattern, which means it looks kind of like a brick pattern. But I made it look more like a checkerboard just for the sake of time and to make sure it wasn't giving you too much to do, because it does take time. And I am going to do a little bit more shading. I'm getting in some of the cast shadows too and some of the darker areas. That helps the illusion. If you have time, go for it, do that. But we're not going to spend all day making it a perfectly detailed drawing. Okay, so here's what the drawing looks like towards the end of the process. And again, not a finished piece, but it shows the idea of 1-point linear perspective on a room.